Forget the superficial headlines you have been fed by the mainstream press. The real game regarding the Strait of Hormuz is playing out on a level of strategy that most pundits completely fail to comprehend. On April 7th, 2026, the United Nations Security Council witnessed an event that fundamentally exposed the shifting tectonic plates of global power. Russia and China effectively dropped a diplomatic bomb by vetoing a resolution targeting the crisis in the Strait of Hormuz. Within minutes, Western media networks were locked up in spoon-feeding you a highly convenient, pre-packaged narrative. They loudly proclaimed that Beijing and Moscow were simply running interference for a rogue Iranian regime, carelessly throwing the global economy under the bus. But that mainstream fairy tale isn't just missing context. It is aggressively and profoundly wrong. I need you to pause and actually process the massive paradox staring us right in the face before we dive any deeper into this. Beijing purchases more Iranian crude oil than anyone else on the planet. A staggering volume of that critical energy relies completely on safe passage through the Strait of Hormuz. Logic dictates that if those waters are choked off, the Chinese economy takes a massive, unprecedented hit. So why on earth would Beijing deliberately sabotage a UN document designed to clear that exact waterway? Why would the primary victim of a devastating oil blockade stand directly in the way of its own supposed salvation? The second you unlock the answer to that specific riddle, the entire geopolitical chessboard flips completely upside down. We aren't looking at a comic book struggle between the noble West and the evil East, or a simplistic binary of protecting Iran versus fighting America. We are witnessing a masterclass in grand strategy, the ruthless manipulation of leverage, and the absolute pursuit of long-term global dominance. When you strip away the propaganda, you realize something truly chilling. Beijing didn't hesitate, and they certainly didn't act defensively. Their veto was an ice-cold calculation, arguably the most brilliant and devastating tactical maneuver we've seen throughout this entire geopolitical standoff. It's a move that silently rewires the global power hierarchy in ways the general public hasn't even begun to fathom. Let's drag the operational details into the light and break them down, because the truth is hiding exactly there, entirely ignored by the masses. When Bahrain initially put that resolution on the UN floor back on April 7th, 2026, it masqueraded as a harmless call to restore maritime freedom and travel in Hormuz. But buried deep in the legal jargon was a loaded gun, the phrase, all necessary means. In the ruthless theater of international diplomacy, those three words aren't just rhetoric. They are a blank check for military escalation, greenlighting a full-scale war under the protective umbrella of international law. The initial vote tally came down to 11 nations in favor, abstentions from Pakistan and Colombia, and hard vetoes from Moscow and Beijing. The press instantly locked in on the lazy explanation that China and Russia were just shielding Iran. But here is the critical sequence of events that happened behind closed doors before the final gavel even fell. The very first draft of that resolution was violently aggressive, virtually begging to authorize any willing nation to blast the strait open with overwhelming military force. That isn't diplomacy. That is legally sanctioned warfare. Pushback was immediate and severe, not just from the East, but even from France, who openly stated the mandate went way too far. Forced to compromise, the drafters completely stripped away the offensive military clauses, making the document drastically softer and highly neutralized. Yet, Beijing and Moscow still blocked it. The drafters neutered it a third time, ripping out direct references to Security Council enforcement mechanisms. Despite the resolution becoming a weak shadow of its former self, the Chinese and Russian delegations continued to ruthlessly kill it, rejecting every single iteration. Immediately, the U.S. ambassador ran to the microphones, peddling the simplistic fiction that Beijing and Moscow were standing shoulder to shoulder with a regime threatening the Gulf. The UK ambassador echoed the exact same talking point, claiming they were just protecting an ally, firmly cementing the mainstream narrative. But are we genuinely analyzing the mechanics of what happened, or are we just swallowing the easiest, pre-packaged excuse? Because when you zoom out and apply a ruthless geopolitical lens, the reality of the situation mutates entirely. Never listen to what a superpower says. Watch exactly what their actions mathematically achieve. Ask yourself the only question that matters. Who actually benefits? Let's apply that framework to China. The country guzzles an astronomical 10 to 11 million barrels of foreign oil daily. An enormous percentage of that petroleum must physically transit through the Strait of Hormuz. On paper, Beijing should be screaming from the rooftops for international intervention to unblock their economic lifeline and restore stability. A shutdown strait undeniably inflicts immediate, agonizing economic trauma on Chinese markets. But Beijing doesn't operate on panicked short-term reactions. They operate on generational timelines. The short-term economic bleeding is totally irrelevant compared to the monumental structural shifts in global power, the exposure of Western dependencies, and the ultimate leverage this crisis accelerates. From a macroeconomic perspective, that veto transforms from a puzzling contradiction into a masterstroke of strategy. They weren't hesitating, and they certainly weren't protecting an ally. They were actively and intentionally redesigning the entire global chessboard. I will say what the establishment won't. This veto was a stroke of absolute strategic genius. Let me walk you through the architecture of this veto, layer by bloody layer, because the absolute brilliance of it compounds with every step. By the time we hit the bottom, the totality of China's grand strategy will be painfully obvious. Look at the first consequence. Even a castrated, watered-down UN resolution would have handed Washington the ultimate prize: undeniable international legitimacy. It would have crowned the U.S. military as the UN-sanctioned sheriff of the Middle East, legally permitted to pacify Hormuz by force. If America swoops in, crushes Iranian resistance, and forces the oil to flow, the message broadcasted to the globe is crystal clear. Washington still holds absolute dominion over the world's energy choke points. It demonstrates that despite the rumors of American decline, the U.S. empire still dictates who gets to turn their lights on. For Beijing, that scenario is absolute poison. It violently shoves them back into their ultimate nightmare: absolute dependency on the United States Navy to keep their domestic economy functioning. Chinese military academies literally call this the Malacca Dilemma, the crippling vulnerability that the U.S. can strangle China's economy at will by choking off maritime sea lanes. Replicating that exact American stranglehold over Hormuz isn't just a setback, it is a strategic catastrophe for Beijing. Therefore, preventing an American victory lap in the Gulf wasn't a choice. It was a matter of national survival. Peel back the second layer, where the financial bloodbath begins. What happens if the disruption drags on and the strait remains a war zone? Oil prices explode, supply chains snap, and global panic sets in. But beneath that chaos, a multi-decade Chinese objective is rapidly accelerating. The closure of Hormuz doesn't just stop tankers, it paralyzes the very heartbeat of the global financial architecture. You have to grasp the mechanics of the petrodollar. Since the 1970s, a pact with Saudi Arabia ensured global oil was priced strictly in US dollars. This forces the entire planet to hoard American currency to buy energy, bankrolling massive US deficits and cementing Washington's total financial supremacy. The dollar is the literal spine of the American empire bereaved Hormuz, and you sever that golden vein. Gulf states can't ship their products smoothly, meaning the infinite geyser of petrodollars stops flooding back into American tech stocks and treasury bonds. As the US-led system cracks under the pressure, desperate nations start asking a highly dangerous question. What if we don't need the US dollar anymore? Enter Beijing's master plan. They've spent years quietly laying the plumbing for an alternative financial universe. Yuan-denominated oil contracts, independent payment rails tied to the Belt and Road Initiative, and a deeply integrated energy network with heavily sanctioned players like Russia and Iran. During times of peace, nobody cares about these alternatives. But when the US-led system is visibly failing, Beijing's lifeboats become irresistible. Every single week, Hormuz remains a war zone. The dollar bleeds and nations pivot toward Chinese alternatives. Every new adoption slowly drains power from Washington and funnels it directly to Beijing. China is eagerly absorbing short-term inflation to permanently dismantle the US dollar's monopoly. They are no longer reacting to America's economic order. They are actively dictating the terms of a new one. Let's rip apart the third layer, which is where amateur analysts entirely humiliate themselves. The immediate counterargument is that China is slitting its own throat by burning through its oil supply. That sounds logical only if you naively assume Beijing is winging it in real time. The brutal truth is that Chinese leadership has spent the last decade meticulously preparing for this exact catastrophe at an unimaginable scale. They've hoarded oceanic quantities of strategic petroleum reserves to weather exactly this kind of storm. They've relentlessly diversified their suppliers to ensure no single blockade can break them. They've poured billions into the China-Pakistan economic corridor to bypass oceanic choke points and access the Arabian Sea directly. They've integrated deeply with Russia and Iran to secure overland energy routes, like the International North-South Transport Corridor, completely immune to U.S. naval blockades. And crucially, they are currently deploying domestic solar, wind, and nuclear generation at a pace that breaks historical records. This isn't some green energy PR stunt. It is hardcore, survivalist strategic independence. When the oil stops, China adapts. They have the shock absorbers and backup systems built directly into their societal framework. Look across the aisle at the US, Europe, Japan, and South Korea are terrifyingly exposed to these exact supply shocks and heavily dependent on maritime stability. This entire crisis is nothing more than a planetary stress test. And in that test, China is unequivocally the most ruthlessly prepared entity on the board. With every passing week of deadlock, the American-enforced maritime order rots, and China's parallel infrastructure gains massive, unparalleled value. Now, dive to the fourth layer, the one the Western establishment desperately ignores, the battle for moral and legal authority. Inside the UN chamber, China's ambassador, Fu Kong, drove a stake through the resolution by pointing out it completely ignored the actual root causes of the crisis. The Russian envoy hammered the exact same nail, arguing the proposal furiously blamed Iran, while conveniently erasing the initial provocations that sparked the fire. Whether you buy into that narrative or not is totally irrelevant. The argument itself is a lethal geopolitical weapon. Look at the sequence of events through the eyes of the developing world. Western powers launch military strikes against a sovereign Iranian state, obliterating their facilities and leadership. Then, when Tehran strikes back, the West suddenly rushes to the UN, demanding a legal permission slip to wage war. To the global South, spanning Africa, Latin America, and Asia, this doesn't look like justice or order. It looks like imperial hypocrisy and the setting of a dangerous precedent. They've watched this exact movie for decades. The West bombs first, then demands international legal cover after the fact. By vetoing the resolution, Beijing isn't just protecting its chessboard, it is blasting a massive signal. They are loudly declaring that they will not rubber stamp Western violence, and that international law isn't a weapon to be wielded only when it suits Washington. This hands Beijing unimaginable narrative power. Almost overnight, they transform from an intimidating economic behemoth into the noble defender of national sovereignty against Western bullying. Conversely, the United States looks like a hypocritical hegemon bending global rules for its own convenience. Wars are won in the minds of the global public long before the first missile is fired. China didn't just block a document. They successfully hijacked the entire global narrative surrounding the conflict, Vatsium out to the macro level, because this veto goes far beyond a single waterway or a regional war. We are violently transitioning from a unipolar world where Washington dictates reality to a fragmented multipolar arena where power is deeply contested and shared. April 7th wasn't just a date. It was the exact moment this transition materialized in real time. The message was deafening. The United Nations Security Council is no longer the State Department's personal rubber stamp. For decades, the U.S. enjoyed unchecked imperial freedom, isolating, sanctioning, and intervening at will. They always got their legal legitimacy because Russia was broken and China hadn't yet risen to fight back. That era officially died with the Hormuz veto. The U.S. demanded the right to secure the world's most critical economic artery, and they were flatly rejected, not due to procedural errors, but because two apex predators looked America dead in the eye and said no. This proves there are now solid, visible, and unyielding limits on American power projection. A matter analysts obsess over troop deployments, ships, and hardware. But real warfare is a multi-dimensional assault across military, economic, political, and narrative domains. You have to assess all four simultaneously to see who is actually dominating. Put on your strategist hat and ask yourself, who is accumulating power right now across all dimensions? Militarily, Beijing hasn't fired a single bullet or deployed a single soldier, yet they successfully neutralized America's legal cover for war. Economically, the prolonged crisis is viciously eroding the petrodollar and forcing the world onto alternative financial tracks that China has already paved. Politically, China has entrenched itself as the champion of the global South, building ironclad trust in regions that will absolutely dictate the future order. And in the narrative theater, Beijing is preaching equality and restraint, while the U.S. is painted as a trigger-happy provocateur acting without justification. Perception shapes reality. This veto was a spectacular, frictionless victory that advanced Chinese interests across every single vector without spilling a drop of blood. True power in this new epoch isn't about having the biggest military. It's about dictating outcomes without ever having to use it. Let me crush the last remaining pathetic counter-argument. The armchair generals love to whine. But China is bleeding money. They can't survive an oil shortage forever. They'll eventually have to cave. Nobody can endure a blockade forever. But that is the fundamentally wrong question. The only metric that matters in a war of attrition is this: who runs out of time first? America's hourglass is draining exponentially faster than China's. Washington is violently incinerating capital, military stockpiles, and domestic goodwill. Interceptor missiles are finite. The American public's tolerance for foreign wars and skyrocketing gas prices is notoriously microscopic. The pressure is mounting on consumers, Congress, and fragile allies. Wars rely on public sentiment and financial endurance, both of which are rapidly cracking in America. Meanwhile, Iran thrives on this exact kind of brutal sanctioned attrition. Their entire strategic culture is built around outlasting Western sieges. They don't need a decisive victory. They just need to avoid losing fast. And then you have Beijing. They are insulated by colossal state reserves, alternative supply corridors, and a government system entirely capable of absorbing domestic economic pain. They aren't panicking. They are executing a calculated holding pattern backed by deep preparation. Time itself is the weapon. If America is rapidly hemorrhaging political capital and economic stability while China merely taps into its strategic reserves, Washington is the one bleeding out. By vetoing the resolution, China denied the U.S. a fast diplomatic and military win. They deliberately stretched the timeline, forcing Washington to choke on its own unsustainable costs. This is the massive blind spot of modern commentary. They look at this like a standard military skirmish, obsessing over who fires more missiles. But this is a brutal, systemic contest over endurance, legitimacy, and the future architecture of human civilization. Iran fights to exist. America fights to preserve its fading credibility, and China is orchestrating the total, slow-motion demolition of the U.S.-led world order. They are doing it with terrifying efficiency. They didn't deploy armies. They used the raw, devastating power of diplomatic institutions and strategic timing. They wielded the ultimate weapon, the ability to say no exactly when America desperately needed a yes. They weaponized diplomacy to delay, frustrate, and alter the trajectory of a global conflict without firing a single shot. When the history books are written, April 7th, 2026 won't be remembered for a bombing raid or a naval maneuver. It will be remembered as the exact moment China stared down the United States and changed the direction of the entire war with a single word. If you still think this was just about protecting an ally, you are completely blind to the mechanics of structure, incentives, and modern power. Once you adopt this geopolitical framework, you immediately stop being manipulated by cheap narratives and finally start seeing the cold, hard strategy underneath. True geopolitical dominance isn't loudly forcing the world to bend to your military will. It is quietly watching your adversary bleed themselves dry while you effortlessly rewrite the rules of the game.